Pleasure to welcome for this morning's session Drew Quarter. Drew is the almost brand new Director for Catholic Identity in the Carroll office here in the Diocese of Cleveland. He started in July 1, we decided, and he's already been very active at work thinking about Catholic identity and working for Cleveland. He himself is a Columbus native who earned his MA in Theological Studies from the University of Dayton, where he also taught undergraduates. After graduate school, he taught moral theology, Catholic social teaching, vocations, and environmental ethics at Bishop Fenwick High School in Middletown, Ohio. 7 years he was there before coming to Cleveland. He's married, he tells me, to a living saint, Kelly, and has 5 children. Drew has handouts, which I will bring around to the tables once he begins. I think that they're the power slides that you'll see. And the title of his session is The Risk of Catholic Education, Teaching from Our Shared Humanity. Please help me in welcoming Drew Quarter.
Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
Oh, very good.
I'm naturally loud anyway, so I don't really know if I can do it, but it is a pleasure to be with you. It really is. I love teaching. Teaching is really close to my heart and something that brings me great excitement and joy. And so working with teachers, talking with teachers is a great excitement. I'm usually dealing with priests now and principals, and they're wonderful folks, but they're not, doing your work, which I think is incredible work, especially teaching theology. So I'm very excited to be with you. As Ed said, I'm a Columbus native. I've been in and around schools for about 10 years, in nonprofits as a social worker for a few years, and then Catholic education for about 9. And then I found this position. I was doing some professional development and in Cincinnati, where I was from, around Catholic identity, so this job was an exciting fit. And I'm excited to share with you about Father Luigi Giussani. Does anyone know Giussani by chance? Just to know what I'm dealing with here. Wonderful. Okay, 2 people I've talked to before, no Giussani. All right, so thank you, yeah, perfect. Yeah. Great. Okay, great, so we have a lot to cover. My plan is to only go, for about 40 minutes. I want to leave ample time for questions that you may have, because I really think that's where the rubber meets the road, is your reality. And so I want to sort of give you a basic overview of some of the life and thought and teachings of servant of God, Father Luigi Giussani, and why I think they're important for you, especially teaching theology. I think certainly all disciplines, but for you especially. And then hopefully give you ample time to ask questions. So, I want to begin with a little context, okay? There's 2 sort of slides that I have for this. The first one is this wonderful book. Is anyone familiar with this book, O. Carter Sneed, What It Means to Be Human? No? 1, 2. Okay, he's professor at law at Notre Dame. He wrote this book a year or 2 ago, Harvard Press. It's an excellent book. It really deals with some of the legal policies around several life issues. Assisted suicide, abortion, IVF, I think, are the 3 main topics. But what he does here, I read this book several years ago, and it's excellent, especially if you teach about abortion or assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide. Very helpful text to understand the legality that exists there. But what I couldn't help but think about when I was reading this text is the fundamental premise. The fundamental premise of the text is that when we create policies about whether the medical issues or whatever it is, wherever we create laws and policies, we do so in order to promote human flourishing. That's what laws are supposed to do. However, every law then has a certain understanding of what it means to be human, and the real question is, does that align with reality of what we actually are? Carter puts it this way. He says, at the deepest level, law and public policy exists for the protection and flourishing of persons. Thus, all law and public policy are necessarily built upon presuppositions about what it means to be and thrive as persons. Now, I'm reading this, and I can't help but think, certainly this is true of law, and that's fascinating, but I think it's also true of education. Education, and specifically pedagogy, presumes an anthropology, and is it the right one? And so that's really what put me on this journey several years ago about thinking about this and really diving into the work of Giussani, is this sort of premise. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about a mentor of mine, Dr. Bill Portier, Professor Emeritus at the University of Dayton. He now is in St. Mary's in Emmitsburg. He wrote a sort of famous article in 2004 called "Here Come the Evangelical Catholics." And I'll give you sort of the breakdown. What he says is that if you want to understand Catholicism in America, there's a lot of different ways that we try and break that down as theologians and historians, pre-Vatican II, post-Vatican II, left, right, Democrat, Republican, whatever it may be. There's a lot of different breakdowns that we have. He says the most helpful one is the subculture and the dissolving of a subculture. So what does he mean by that? If you were to track sort of immigrant Catholicism in the 19th and 20th century, you have immigrants coming from Europe that land into hostile territory. Protestants are deeply suspicious of Catholics. They can't be American. They trust a guy overseas over their president. You can't trust them. A lot of discrimination against Catholics. Irish need not apply was a popular sign, particularly in Boston, if you can imagine. This is what my great-grandfather faced when he came from Ireland to Boston in 1921. As a response, Catholics formed ghettos. They formed these subcultures, these communities, often of like people. So you got your Irish parish, your German parish, your Polish parish, whatever it is. And through this subculture, Catholics were able to transmit the faith fairly easily. They shared languages, they shared cultures and customs and signs and symbols. And so the transmission of the faith worked fairly well. The problem was, around the 1960s, this subculture starts to dissolve. Catholics begin to make it in the world. Demographically speaking, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Catholics begin to look more and more like the average American. They made it. JFK is elected president, everyone loses their mind. A Catholic is president. This is wild. And so what we see is that as the subculture in the United States of Catholics dissolve, these children primarily are thrown into the waters of volunteerism, like their Protestant counterparts, and you can no longer assume that your children will be Catholic. My great-grandparents could do that. What else would they be? Right? But certainly for my children, I cannot assume that. There's no way that I could safely assume that about my own children. They're just awash in the world. And so all these forces are at play with them, and we can't make these assumptions. Now, what does that mean for my presentation? What does that mean for you? What it means is that the way that we have tried to and have historically communicated the faith to our students no longer works. We make assumptions, willingly or unwillingly, about students in Catholic schools, whether they're Catholic or non-Catholic, that they know certain things. You get into your freshman class, first semester, and you mention something like, well, the magisterium doesn't think that. And everyone, what's the magisterium? And you're like, what? You're like, it's one of the 7 sacraments, Timmy. It's really important. And the kid's like, what's a sacrament? And you're like, how have you made it this far and not know what a sacrament is, right? You lose your mind just a little bit. You panic. The language that we have used for a long time just doesn't work. It doesn't connect because we don't live in that world anymore. That world's gone. That subculture has dissolved, and not many people speak the language. And if they do, they're not likely to be your students. And so that I think is an important historical context to realize as we sort of work into Giussani. So Father Giussani was born in 1922 in the Archdiocese of Milan. He quickly was singled out for being very smart and entered a minor seminary when he was young, of course, as many did during this time. He was eventually ordained a priest, deemed very intelligent, though slightly sickly, and taught at the university. It's an interesting time, and I have not looked into it extensively, but there's a number of photos, and it's, if you know the life of a priest, it's reasonable to suggest that he would have rubbed shoulders with who would later become Paul VI at the time, because he was Archbishop of Milan during this time. And so I'm always curious about the interaction, because when I read like Evangelium Nuntiandi, I can't help but think of Giussani. And so, but there's something in the water in Milan in this time. The teachers that he's getting, the schools he's getting, they're doing this a little differently. Now, I don't know how familiar you guys are with sort of like the trends of Catholic theology, and during this time, we're in what we would call the manualist tradition, right? Straight up scholasticism. You're reading Thomas question by question, and it's right because Thomas said it was right, so of course. And so these guys are soaked in Augustine and Aquinas and Aristotle in ways that we cannot even fathom. Like, it's the water and air that they drink and breathe. This is, and so it's interesting, and we'll get to this a little bit later. Giussani doesn't reference Thomas very much, or Aquinas very much, but if you're familiar with Thomas and Aquinas, Augustine and Aquinas, you realize, good grief, it's everywhere. So, he's teaching seminary, and then he gets this new assignment, and it kind of scares him to death. He gets sent to a high school to teach theology, and he's terrified. And he has sort of two major moments in his life that stand out to him frequently. The first, he's on a train ride back to Milan, long train. And he overhears these students talking about their faith and talking about Christianity, and he's just sort of confused at the words they're using and how they're using them, and he's just like, they don't know what they're talking about. Like, how could this be? This is 1950 Italy. He's thinking, how could this be? And so he begins to ask them, like, why are you talking this way? Like, what's going on? And he just listens to their concerns, and it begins to dawn on him sort of preemptively than what we're dealing with now, that this time of passing the faith has changed. Something is shifting. He caught this early on. That's why I think he's such a great person to look at for inspiration today. And his first day in the classroom, he walks into his class, and you have one of these students. I know you do. What happens is a kid in the back of the class sticks his hand up in the air and goes, "Father, why are we even here? We're learning about the faith, which is irrational. Why are we even doing this? Why would we learn about something stupid like that?" You have a student like that. I know you do. We all do. And he immediately says, "Well, why do you say that? What is faith?" And the kid, struggles to give some sort of coherent response. And he says, "Well, how can you criticize a thing you don't even know what you're talking about?" And then he says, "Well, what is reason? You think reason is superior? What is it?" And the kid can't describe reason either. And so he gets upset. And he realizes that this is an error from the philosophy department, as it sometimes is. And so he walks next door to the teacher teaching philosophy, and he says, "What are you doing to these children? What are you teaching them? They're saying nonsense." And all the kids are huddled at the door, you can imagine, right? The teachers are fighting. The teachers are fighting. And Giussani begins to realize, did I drop my thing? You broke it. Sorry, Ed. He begins to realize that there's a certain philosophy happening here, a certain kind of thought. And so Giussani sort of picks on him. He says, "I believe that the United States of America exists. I've never been. Do you believe that?" And sort of like a strict philosophical materialist, he says, "No." And Giussani says, "There you have it. Which one do you think is more reasonable, the one who thinks that it exists through faith or the one that doesn't?" And this is really a launching point for Giussani in the way that he thinks about education. So I have a few resources on here for you. The first is the religious sense. The religious sense is excellent. The first 4 chapters are like a modern interpretation of Augustine, and it's incredible. Got a battery for you too. Sorry about that. I break things. And so the religious sense is an incredible book. I highly recommend it. Now, Giussani's writing in the 60s and 70s, so he's like everyone else in this time in sort of like a highfalutin existentialism. You're like, "What? The I is the I, thou shalt know." And you're like, "What are you talking about, man? Like, I'm lost." So he can be like that sometimes. You just got to stick with it. In 1977, he writes The Risk of Education, which is the focus sort of of today. He's writing specifically about his experience teaching high schoolers theology. Now, along the way in his life, he starts this lay ecclesial movement by accident called Community and Liberation, CL. And this is a group of lay people who just want to see Christ in their day-to-day life and encounter problems together. I'll explain what all that means in a second. And this movement has grown. It's all over now. There's a thing called CLU, C-L-U, which is Community and Liberation for Universities now, at places like Notre Dame, and University of Dayton, I think, has a small chapter, kind of all over South Dakota. And Giussani is named a Monsignor by JP2 in 1983, and then passes in 2005. In 2005, he was the head of Community and Liberation. Father Julian Carroll takes over from there in 2020. So Carroll, during his time as the leader of CL, writes Disarming Beauty, which it's philosophically dense, I have to tell you, but it is one of the most influential books that I've ever read. It has hands down shaped my life more than almost any other text. It's not the Bible, all the things, right? But it's very good, because what Carroll has the ability to do is take all the thought and method of Giussani and combine him with the thought of Benedict XVI and sort of combine them, and it's incredible. It's incredible. So I highly recommend those books as well as resources for you. So let's talk about this, right? If it's true that law presumes anthropology and understanding of the human person, well, and I think it's true that education does the same, what is Giussani's? And I think it might be helpful at this point to try and contrast with what I see today. Maybe you see this as well. I hear from students sometimes, and I've walked by the classroom enough times to know that the teacher in AP Gov stands up there and he lectures. We had block scheduling, so hour and a half. He lectures for an hour and a half, and the students are like in Ferris Bueller. They're asleep and falling over. And maybe occasionally we'll ask a question like in Ferris Bueller, but right, your job as a student is to write and take notes of the information and remember it and put it on a test. And that is education. This view, which I think is fairly common, we sometimes do it in theology, views students as sort of an empty vessel. And you, the sage on stage, pour valuable knowledge into their minds to be retained. I don't think this is a great view. I certainly don't think we can get this from the tradition. So what is Giussani's anthropology? He begins, like many in his time, with Aristotle. I don't know how familiar you are with Aristotle, but Aristotle believed in these things called natures, and these natures wanted things. In our case, happiness. The human person is after truth and goodness and ultimately happiness. That's what we're after. We can't help it. We can't help it. Everything we do is oriented towards that. We cannot help it. Now, why? And that's all from the Nicomachean Ethics. So if you're familiar with Aristotle, that's fairly well known. It's the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics. I don't have that up here. I have the Physics, book 2. In the Physics, he does this other thing where he talks about what he calls natural movements, movements of the nature. And this is really important for you, the educator. Why? Because I've heard it called an assisting art. I don't know where I got that. I tried to find it. I can't. But we get closest to it here in the Physics. This is to distinguish between an art proper and an assisting art. Art proper is that you have a block of marble in front of you and you sculpt David. It would not be that had it not been for your hands. An assisting art is different. In an assisting art like medicine or agriculture or education, the thing that you are working on wants to do something. It wants to be something. And your job is to facilitate that, is to cultivate that. Now, in the case of a plant, an acorn wants to be an oak tree. I always ask my students what an acorn wants to be, and they have no idea. Oh, a pine? They're so wrong. An acorn tree. Like, what's that called, guys? It's an oak tree. Okay, just so you know, it's an oak tree. It wants to do something already. The block of marble doesn't want to do anything. The student, the body, and this is where in the Physics book too, Aristotle's trying to make the distinction of like, yeah, we can say that the physician heals, but that's not really true. That's not really what's happening. We can say that. The body is actually healing. The body is doing what the body wants and is oriented towards doing. You just help and facilitate. Give it, a certain medicine or whatever it may be. Exercise, whatever. So the things that we're working on already have a natural movement. So we start there with Giussani's anthropology. Next is Augustine. This movement is not just towards happiness, truth, and goodness, but it's also towards God, ultimately, fundamentally, which is great news for us. We've always got an inside pitch, right? We've always got an inside lane to talking with our students if we can be aware of that. That they want to know God. They maybe don't know that, they maybe don't know how to describe that, but they do. Likewise, I mentioned here De Magisterio, Augustine's teaching on the teacher. If you haven't read it, I recommend reading it. I would read sections 40 to 46. It's the very end of it, because the other parts are kind of confusing if you're not familiar with reading more ancient philosophy. He's talking about signs and how we communicate. And it's really important, but it's sort of the peak of it, the pinnacle of that argument is in sections 40 and 46, where he says, you do not teach, you don't give knowledge. That's not what you do. Because when I say something, you generate an image or an understanding of a concept based on your experience, based on your mind. The knowledge comes from your mind, not from my words. And this is an important distinction. The knowledge that your students gain come from their mind, not your words. Your words are like a catalyst, but they only go so far. And so knowledge is really generated in your students, not with how amazing you are at talking about Deuteronomy or whatever it is. That's helpful, but it's an important thing to realize. Last but not least, St. Thomas also has an honor on the teacher, where he says similar things, expands upon it a little bit through his classic style. But it says basically the same thing. A teacher facilitates knowledge, they don't necessarily give it. One can be instructed or one can discover, but the knowledge always comes from the subject's interaction with reality and is generated from that. Okay, so why is any of this important? Well, let's see how Giussani applies this in The Risk of Education. He says early on that there are 3 marks of a true education. The first, education requires an adequate proposal of the past. We can call that tradition. If you love MacIntyre, you can call that a narrative. I would say, I use sort of more scientific language, I would call it explanatory sufficiency. Meaning this is the best story we have to explain the facts of the past. This is how science operates. You know, Aristotle thought rocks loved the earth. Why? If I throw a rock up, what happens? It goes down. Obviously rocks love the earth. You try and separate them and they love each other so much they want to be together. How romantic. Okay, Newton came along and gave us a different understanding that better explained the past and our world around us, so it has explanatory sufficiency. Call it gravity. Okay, so this is the tricky part about his 3 marks, Giussani's 3 marks, is that they are logically in order, but they're not chronologically in order. Okay, so here's the second one. The past, tradition, may only be proposed to young people if presented within the present lived experience that underscores its correspondence with the ultimate needs of the heart. Okay, what does that mean? Well, in more simpler terms, he says a true education is one that corresponds to our humanity, right? That the pedagogy matches the anthropology. The criteria, and this is the hard part, the criteria for judgment is present within the human heart. What you say, they judge that against their own hearts, not against like, well, Freud said this. Like, they don't judge it like that. They don't do that. They judge it from their own experiences and their own heart, whether or not to care or to go to sleep. That judgment is not how amazing you are, though that's helpful. It's within themselves. Now, why is this sort of logically in order but not chronologically? I'll get to this a little bit more in the next slide, but what this means is that whatever you teach, and this is a big mistake I see in theology classes all around. Whatever you teach, you got to start with the human person. You have to. The last school I was at, they taught Old Testament to freshmen. And they would start like, well, how did Scripture come to be? Let's put that together. That's a fine logical starting point. And then they work through the Old Testament books. That's all great. But no one cares. No one cares. To start a class on church history with Jesus and the apostles is beautiful. I get it, but no one cares. The question for our students is, why the church? Why should I care about this thing? We can't assume that they have knowledge because they come from a Catholic household or a Catholic neighborhood or whatever it was. They love their confirmation so much and they're passionate about their saint name, whatever. It doesn't matter. We have to begin with their humanity. Why is this relevant to your own experience in your heart? Who cares about the church? Because it's only then is the Council of Trent may be interesting. Right? You've never heard a student who's just I didn't care about my faith, but then Mr. Goodale taught about the Council of Trent, and I am on fire. No one has said that. No offense to him, he's a wonderful teacher. No one has said that. It's only interesting because, and you may find the Council of Trent interesting because you have a question. You have an interest. Your heart is invested, and you want to see how do people over time who also think what I think and have the same questions that I have answer that. And so it begins always, sacraments, scripture, church history, ecclesiology, morality, vocations. It should all begin in the human heart. That's the only way you get someone today. Because the language that we have used is gone and doesn't work. Last but not least. True education must be an education in criticism. But what does he mean by this? Well, he gives a sort of image of a young child, and their teachers and parents are filling their backpack for the day. Well, Timmy, why do you have this in your backpack? Because my mom said so. Because my mom put it there. Well, Timmy, why do you have this in your backpack? Oh, my teacher said so. And that works for a while for kids. But at some point, they're carrying their backpack, and they stop and they go, why the hell am I carrying this thing? What is even in here? It's so heavy. And they start looking through it, and there's a problem. He goes back to the Latin for problem to get the word criticism. It becomes a problem. It attracts their attention, and they begin looking and saying, why do I have this? Because my teacher told me so doesn't work anymore. Right? Maybe you're an outdoors person, I love hiking and being outside. If you've ever gone hiking with someone who doesn't go hiking, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They bring their guitar, and they've got all this stuff. And at some point, you're on your 16-mile hike, and they're like, why did I think this is a good idea? And you're like, because you're an idiot. But it's because they didn't know, and it wasn't a problem until they got along the journey, and it was. And it raised to their awareness a specific issue which they now have to address. So when Gisani is talking about criticism, he's talking about this moment in someone's life where the things that they're carrying now have to be examined. And they have to be critical. Why did I carry this? What is this for? And this is where you come in. You are encountering students in this moment all the time, and it is a beautiful gift. It is a beautiful gift to be able to walk alongside them and explain why what's packed is packed there, and maybe why some of it should be thrown out. So, this is sort of, and this is, just to be clear, Gisani's The Risk of Education. This is where the risk happens. There's no way around it, though, in education. Because it's at this moment that a kid says, the church is worth it. The church isn't worth it. This Jesus guy is full of it. He's the Lord. It's at this moment, and it is a risk, because you can't guarantee the outcome. You can walk alongside them, but you can't guarantee the outcome here. It truly is, education in the fullest sense truly is a risk. A sort of introduction to reality. So, what does this mean for you? Why should you care? The first thing, in light of the dissolving of the subculture, teaching theology should begin from the human starting point. I've already talked about this, right? Whether you're teaching sacraments, vocations, start with the fundamental human question right now that they have. I know logically it makes sense to be like, well, a sacrament is a sign of grace or whatever. I don't know. I didn't pay attention to my sacrament class. That's great, and it makes sense logically, but that's not where our students are. And you might be like, well, they're sophomores, so they should have gotten some of this freshman year. Okay, we all know how that goes. right? They were maybe awake. They maybe retained some of that freshman year stuff. So we have to drop the assumptions and begin at them. Why should a human care about a sacrament? Why should a human care about the church? That's where we have to begin, because the culture has changed in a way for Catholics in the United States where the things that we used to say and the ways that we used to communicate, they just don't work anymore. Number 2, pedagogy presumes an anthropology. Your students, whether they know it or not, want to know the truth and they want to do the good. Now, they may be wrong on what's truthful, and they may be wrong about what a good is. But if you can understand that that's how they're built, it allows you to empathetically enter into a conversation with them. Timmy, why did you cheat on that test? Right? Well, because I wanted a good grade. Okay, that's a good, but that's not the best way to get there. So now we can have that conversation. Right? As opposed to just sort of stopping. I'll give you an example. This is one of my favorite examples. I had a student several years ago. Smart girl. She was a good student. I would say somewhat of a rule follower in the classroom. I'm teaching morality and I'm talking about marriage. And at some point, cohabitation comes up. And one of the students raised their hand in shock of what I've been saying and says, "What are you talking about? Of course I would live with my boyfriend before I married him." I'm like, whoa, I'm kind of confused. I had certain expectations and assumptions about this student. And I'm also thinking, is she trying to fight me right now? What are we doing right now? Is she trying to square off in front of her peers? What's going on? So I asked questions. I was like, well, why would you think that, Heidi? And she gives mediocre answers. I'm like, you don't believe that based on the reasons you just gave. So I keep asking. And it came down to the fact that she didn't want to get a divorce. She wanted a long-term, loving, committed relationship and didn't want a divorce. And so she wanted to make sure she was marrying the right one. I can get on board with that. I want that too. Is that the best way to get there? We can talk about that. But if I just presume that she was just trying to piss me off or whatever it was, we're like, that's the wrong answer, quiet, next. Then we wouldn't have gotten to what's really happening. And so we have to understand, our students aren't vessels that we fill with knowledge, and their questions are because they don't understand, what you said 5 minutes ago, because they're furiously writing notes. It's because of their nature. We'll get to it in a second. All right, third. How am I doing on time? Oh yeah, cruising. Teaching theology should be done dialectically. If it is true that you are not teaching them in the strict sense, but that their knowledge and information comes from them, then your job is to facilitate their growth in knowledge. And the best way to do that is just to go question by question. They ask you a question, ask them a question back. Oh, thank you. No, I'm sorry, I'm wrecking all your things. It's because it's not open here. I'll click it over here. Perfect. All right, take 2. So try and ask questions. I did this exercise. We should have spent more time on it looking back, but it is what it is. With other teachers. Do this within your department maybe if you have time. Have one person take a lesson that they're going to teach. Okay? Begin to teach it to your peers. Peers, you need to do a good job of asking high school questions of that content. And you, as the teacher, can only respond with other questions. Call it the question game, right? Well, so if you're talking about abortion and, you say abortion is killing a human person, you're like, well, it's not a human person. I'd say, well, when does a human person begin? When do you think? Well, when they're, born. I'm like, well, I don't know if, the process of birth, it gives the blessing of human life. Is that what you're saying? Right? And just begin to ask them questions because you're pruning them. You're helping them work through the questions that are important. So as much as you can, be Socratic. Socratic, I'm sure there's other dialectical styles. I just know the Socratic method. So try and, if it's true that they are the ones that are learning and it's not because of, the terms you gave them or whatever, then help them to really let those concepts sink in and become rooted, right? And the best way is to encourage them to do so. Okay, last but not least. Invite questions. Questions are the touch points to their heart. And they may be stupid. They may be about Minecraft or Game of Thrones, that one scene, you know what I'm talking about. It may be all sorts of things that you're like, why are we talking about this? And sometimes, you're a teacher, so you have to prudentially decide, like, AJ's just full of crap, we're going to ignore that, and move on. But for the most part, I will say students, they ask questions and maybe they sound ridiculous, but they are genuine. And if you want access to their heart, that's it. Pay attention. Listen up. Take it seriously. I have had students that have told me, like, well, my elementary school theology teacher told me that it was wrong to ask questions. And I was just like, oh, God, no, please don't do that. We can't, and that's probably out of an elementary school teacher who doesn't know the answer, and so it sort of doubles down like, well, it's what the church teaches. Don't do that. Don't do that. Be open in the conversation. Take their question seriously. Take their question seriously, because that's where their heart is. It is
great. Sorry. Sorry to cut this off. Join me in thanking once again.